Welcome to Turning Pages, a series of in-depth conversations with authors about their works.
All right, well, his new book is called 21 Things You Need to Know About Indigenous Self-Government. Bob Josephs joins me on the program to discuss it. Welcome to the show, Bob.
Thank you.
So this is a follow-up to 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act, which was released in 2018. I'm curious, first of all, about kind of like, was it coming out of conversations about that first book that this book kind of started?
Yeah, definitely. We had, I think we sold, somewhere in the neighborhood of 170,000 copies of 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act. And I did a lot of talks and presentations and interviews like this one. And often after every one of those sort of talks, I would get questions about, can we get rid of it? What will it look like? And will it work? And so that really was sort of the genesis for thinking maybe I should try and tackle that. I also, it's personal for me as well, right? I'm a hereditary chief. I've got a chief's name and a chief's seat. I haven't done my potlatch yet, but as soon as I do, I'll be in business, as it were. And both my parents grew up in a time where they couldn't vote in the early part of their lives, and they went to residential schools, and so dismantling the Indian Act is something that would be important to me for sure.
Yeah, I was curious because the language change in the title from "you may not know" to "you need to know" feels like an activation, right? Like that this is not like, this is curiosity. This is like, this needs to happen. And is that coming about through discussions with audiences and people in the subsequent years, tied in with your kind of move towards this chiefhood and like learning more about self-government from that perspective as well?
Yeah, it does. And next year will mark 150 years of the Indian Act. It's, in the top 10 of oldest legislation in the country. It was designed to assimilate, but it obviously hasn't worked. It's kept them separate, on living under different laws and on different lands than everybody else. And so we're in my research for the book, I was meeting with chiefs and other leaders, and they were asking me what I was going to do, to be involved in the conversation that's going to happen next year. So there's going to be a lot of chatter about the Indian Act, and also when we think about some of the big conflicts that we've seen, the Coastal GasLink project and the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs, those are, we're looking at that again because we really haven't done much to address the problem other than with the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs. And it is an Indian Act problem. If we look at the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, there's a principle called free, prior, and informed consent that we're supposed to use when we're consulting with them on projects like Coastal GasLink. And if you dive into what the free means, it means free of control from outside influence. And so originally we had hereditary chiefs and other types of traditional leaders, but along came Confederation, then the Indian Act. And the Indian Act said, the way you're governing yourselves, that's wrong. You should elect a chief and council like everybody else is doing. And so we really imposed an electoral system on self-governing communities. And the way it stands today is that you're elected by your people and you're accountable to Indian affairs. That's how the Indian Act is structured. And so we would say it's not a free system to go and talk to the chief and council. And when I listen back on the Coastal GasLink conversations, a lot of government's messaging was, we have signed agreements with all of the elected councils all along the pipeline. And the problem with that, of course, it's not free. They went to, people that today, I think they shouldn't go to, but we'll wait and see what's going to happen in the big infrastructure stuff.
You mentioned the research process for this book. Was it drastically different than for the previous book, or like had you kind of trod these grounds before and just kind of went deeper on it?
Yeah, so the research was, we did do a little bit, when I started to hear those questions, it got me pondering and thinking, and sort of built up the energy. And one of the things I did was reach out to the booksellers, Page Two, Raincoast Books, and I said, I'm hoping you can help me. I'd love to go out and just do some talks on Indigenous self-government to see if there's an interest there, from book readers and they were very generous, helped me out, got me a couple of book festivals where we went and talked about Indigenous self-government, and really got a lot of great feedback from that. We took it a step further and sent out a what would you call it, a poll or, some kind of a newsletter piece where we asked, the question, would you be interested in this topic and what would you want to know about that? So that went out to 9,000 subscribers. I think those would be the two big things. And then, I run this company called Indigenous Corporate Training. And from time to time, I get out and train government and corporate clients. And we're always getting lots of questions about self-government, throughout the years and how to get rid of the Indian Act. And so that, all of that let me dive deeper into this book, obviously.
So whether it's the 9,000 subscribers or the folks that you do the presentations for, it's essentially like kind of almost like market research to see like what questions keep popping up that need to be addressed.
Yeah, and we got a couple of good ones. We did we did a presentation in Ottawa on this topic a couple of years ago now, probably 2.5 years ago, at a writers festival, and we spent the whole night answering questions about sovereignty and whether this was a separatist movement and what it would look like, and so I realized that if we're going to have this conversation about dismantling the Indian Act and moving to self-government, that we really need to address this idea of sovereignty and what it means. And so, when I think about Alberta, they're having a conversation about separating from Canada. And what I see is the First Nations people there saying, well, if you're going to leave Alberta, we're not going with you because we have treaty lands and an agreement with this country. And we saw the same response in the Quebec referendum as well, where the just before the referendum, the Cree issued a press release saying if Quebec separates, the Cree will separate from Quebec and take their ancestral lands with them. So, it was my way of trying to figure out how do I answer this question really quickly. Is this a broad separatist movement? And it's not, of the 25 self-government agreements already in place. Laws of general application will continue to apply. The criminal code, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, environmental protection, all of that stuff will continue. So it's not about separation. And then on the First Nations side of things, some of the questions, the big question is, are we ready? And that one really did stump me in the research and writing process, because I was thinking, ready, that's more of a feeling, than an action, which we need to take really get out of this relationship. And I realized, though, I talked to a few people and we came to the conclusion that we were self-governing for about 10,000 years before Canada and before the Indian Act. And we've continued to hang on to that self-government, even though the Indian Act has been there and has been a dominant force and in the lives of Indians and lands reserved for Indians, but there's still stewardship programs. They still talk about, being stewards of the land and all of those kinds of good things. So,
and I guess that does the question of like, are we ready, does raise the larger question of like, what does ready look like, or what do we conceive of as ready, right? And that, in some sense, like there's no real starting line for something like this. There's a past with government, and there's a future with government, and then there's where we are right now.
Yeah, and it was a tough one, trying to think about that. And it's been like through my whole career, how do we get ready, and who should lead this, and all kinds of really interesting questions. And one of the pivotal sort of learning moments of my life, and it was around this subject of readiness, was a number of years ago. I was getting ready with the family to go to Florida. We're going to go to the Magic Kingdom and, spend a couple, 3 days in Disney World. And just before we left, though, there was a major news announcement, coming through a lot of the big press, American and Canadian press, that the Seminole tribe of South Florida had bought the Hard Rock Cafe international gaming and food chain. And so I said to my wife, Cindy, if we get time, can we take a day out of the Magic Kingdom and go visit the Seminoles? They've got a cultural center. They've got some ecotourism opportunities. I just want to try and get a feel for how big they are and how are they able to do this, and really, what would what's motivating them. And so we went to the cultural center. I signed in using my traditional name, Aksum Malagalese, and there was the clerk kind of looked at it, ran into the back, came out with the manager, and he came running over and said, "Hey, are you an Indian?" And I said, "Yeah, you can call me that." And he said, "Do you want a tour?" And I said, "Yes, I'd love one." So, the whole idea of the tour for me was to be able to ask a couple of questions. The first one was, how many Seminole tribal members are there? And he told me there were just over 1,200 at that time. And I said, that's good because I come from a little band of less than 50 people where I come from. And so, if we could do at scale what you've done, I think we'd be pretty happy. And then, the next big question was, how do you get there? There's only 1,200 of you. You're constrained by the Bureau of Indian Affairs and all the land ownership and all of that stuff. Tell me about that. And he said, you know what? In the early 1980s, it's 82 or 83, I can't remember the exact date right now, but he said, we were sitting around the tribal council table, and what we realized is that if we wait for the Bureau of Indian Affairs to do anything for us, to look after us, we're never going to make it as a people, he said. And he said that was our moment. And it was just that notion that, there's no help coming. We've got to do this ourselves. And he said, based on that conversation, we decided to get into business, to get into the game, as it were. And so the first thing they did was, same constraints that we have here in Canada. They did a bingo night and they started to raise money doing that. And that turned into two and then three. And then, in a short while, they were doing 7 nights a week of bingo. And then they noticed outside of the reservation, they call them reservations in the States, we call them reserves, that there was a bingo palace for sale. So they bought that, and then they bought another one, and they bought another one. Then they noticed nearby there was an old casino that could use a little bit of love and some marketing attention. So they purchased that, and basically they monopoly gamed their way into purchasing the Hard Rock Cafe International Gaming and Food Chain. And it really the readiness was just this realization, that we're not going to, the Indian Act, in our case, if I look at it from our perspective, the Indian Act's not there to help us. It's still designed to assimilate. And if anything positive is going to happen, we really just got to make a decision and start to go. And so that for me was, I was like, yes, this is all it takes. It doesn't, we don't have to wait for some broad table setting initiative with the government, because there have been self-government agreements that have been negotiated since the early 80s, but there's only 25 agreements. They include about 45 First Nations, and there's actually over 600 First Nations in Canada. So, again, if we wait for a federal process, it's not gonna work, and we need to keep moving now, because the Indian Act continues to do what it's designed to do, which is troll people off the list, right?
Yeah, and as you point out, I mean, it was 1969 that the government of Canada released the white paper on calling for the removal of the Indian Act, right? Like that it's been on the books for a long time that this is something that should happen or might need to happen, but this is not a government that's in the position or willingness to kind of write itself out of this.
Yeah, yeah. So way back in 1869, the federal government took the fiduciary duty to look after Indians and lands reserved for Indians. They set up the relationship as a trustee wardship relationship, and they made this commitment to look after the wards until they assimilate. And then we consolidated all of the piecemeal laws covering Indians in Confederation into the Indian Act, the Consolidated Indian Act of 1876. And that steamed along until the 1960s, when Trudeau and Chrétien were asked to look at, what do we do about this policy? It's not working. It's costing lots of money. There's all kinds of challenges with it. They went out, Elder Trudeau and Chrétien, and looked at it and said, you know what? We should transfer title to the reserves. We should get rid of the Indian Act, and that'll make us a more just society. And that became the 1969 white paper policy paper. The chiefs across the country, leadership across the country, countered with the red paper policy, largely because they didn't see how they were going to be able to pick themselves up and look after themselves. They were going to be at their worst period in history ever with no resources, completely reliant on federal funding and programs. And so they said, wait a second, Canada, you took a legal obligation to look after us till we assimilate. We haven't. And we're going to hold you to that legal obligation until we assimilate, or if you want to sit down and negotiate self-government with us, we'd be happy to have those conversations. But we're going to need some lands and resources and the ability to make decisions about those lands and resources. And we will participate in the political and economic mainstream of this country, but in a way that protects our cultures. And so it was an interesting time, the 1969 white paper to where we are today. 40, 60, my math's not good. Decades
69,
later,
so
let's say
50,
that.
56 years, I think.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah. Decades later, that's probably the best way to say that.
yes, no, absolutely. And I mean, it does seem like a lot of the conversations and groundwork like is still kind of in its nascent phase. Like you said, 600 nations or communities that would need to negotiate, and we're only at about 40 who have
Yeah.
agreements. Like
Or
that's a very small percentage.
Yeah, and you know what? We can't keep going on like this, like the Seminole tribes, right? We're wrestling with all kinds of challenges, still reconciling after residential schools. Missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls is a big issue because of housing on reserves and being forced into urban centers with no programs or service. Like every time I see an issue, the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs and Coastal GasLink, a lot of stuff points back to the Indian Act here, and it's just not helpful. And in writing this book, I'm really hoping that Canadians will feel comfortable, learning about it and then engaging in the conversation and building broad public support to really move beyond and dismantle the act.
One thing I learned about from this book in particular was around access to capital markets and the limitations that the Indian Act
Mhm.
does on Indigenous peoples and communities. And I'm wondering if you can kind of talk about that aspect of things.
Yeah, yeah. So I bumped into it after finishing college. I did a 2-year program in business administration at Camosun College in Victoria, and then I was very fortunate in finding a job at BC Hydro, the big utility in the province, and got married and had kids and all of that stuff. And at some point, I decided I needed a new automobile for the commute to work, and went down and talked to a car dealership, found a vehicle, and then was, transferred to the business services manager who would work on the loan application. And so as we worked our way through the loan application, one of the things she said was, "Are you a status Indian?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And she said, "Okay, so you're exempt from taxes, but," she said, "we're going to need you to get a cosigner for this vehicle." And I said, "I'm a little bit surprised you're asking. If I studied credit in college and I meet the 4 C's of credit. I'm married, I have a post-secondary education, I have a job at a utility, all of the signs of credit were there, but they still couldn't lend me the money because the under the Indian Act, Indians are not subject to seizure under legal process. That's just the wording as it reads exactly. And so she really needed a cosigner. If it wasn't for my wife, who's non-Indigenous, I wouldn't have been able to borrow the money to buy the vehicle. And that's when it really sort of hit home. People think there's a lot of advantages. They don't have to pay taxes on goods or services. But on the other hand, they can't access capital markets, which I think is a way bigger problem than the exemption. And so that's a little bit for you about
Yeah, and
taxes.
as you point out, this is something that basically does the opposite of what the Indian Act was designed to do in terms of assimilation. That this continues to keep Indigenous people isolated from mainstream society.
It does, yeah, yeah. If we were in hindsight, if we were to look back and say, how can we get people to assimilate? You wouldn't pass a set of laws that's different from the ones that everybody else lives under. You know what I mean? Like we would. and put them on different lands than everybody else. So, academics and historians have said that's probably the biggest mistake. If you want people to assimilate, which is actually a natural process, you put them together and make them toil the same way as everybody else does. But it just didn't work out. And Canada, felt that it would, but it never did. We got more aggressive, and still it didn't work. And here we are today.
Yeah, it's particularly, I mean, obviously, with this act having been, like you said, coming up on 150 years, to think back of the purpose of it, or like the rationale behind it, and then like how wrong-headed it was in achieving those goals,
Mhm.
like that it was designed to fail in some sense,
Yeah.
despite efforts to the contrary.
Yeah, yeah. And I have an analogy. In 1982, we patriated our Constitution in Canada. You see the Queen and Trudeau signing the agreement. And that really marked the end of forced cultural assimilation. We decided we're going to start to do things differently. In fact, Section 35 of the Constitution Act said we're going to recognize and affirm the existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Aboriginal people of Canada. And so that became, our focus. But the Indian Act is still there. It's still a piece of legislation. And it's still doing what it was designed to do, which is take people's names off the list. So to me, it's like a drift net that has broken free of the mothership on the high seas. The ship isn't around, but the drift net's still doing what it's supposed to be doing. And that's what we've got to think about as we dismantle the Indian Act. And I had to choose the words actually quite carefully. Dismantle the Indian Act. It is possible to get rid of it completely. We have examples like the Niska Treaty and in British Columbia, for example. But I think when we dive into it, we're trying to create more opportunities for the individuals while maintaining that nation to nation relationship. So that's kind of the balancing act, if you will.
Now, a more recent act that, or rather, legal document that you point to, and you start the first point of the 21 things you need to know with, which is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, as being kind of the thing that sets the standard. How important a document is that in terms of like your view of like all things that kind of follow it in terms of this process towards self-governance?
Yeah. So, the Declaration is an aspirational, non-binding document, but it was worked on by Indigenous peoples around the globe, people like Wilton Littlechild out of Alberta and Ed John from British Columbia, who sat around a UN sort of table coming up with things that would help Indigenous peoples around the globe. And so there's been a lot of thought into it. And we're not the only country that wrestles with Indigenous issues. Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, there's lots of countries. There's over 350 million Indigenous peoples in the globe. And so they really worked on this Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which Canada was actually one of the last nation states to endorse without condition. It was something that we wrestled with, and we wrestled with it because the wording in the free, prior, and informed consent, right? We're supposed to get consent of the Indigenous peoples when we're building mines and pipelines and upgrading highways and doing dams and all of that stuff. And so Canada really didn't like the consent portion because we have a whole body of constitutional law that says that consent isn't, there would only be some cases where consent was required. And so we pushed back quite hard, even though we had a big role in creating the document, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And so, you know, of the over 160 nation states, there were only a few holdouts in the end: Canada, the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. And New Zealand, I think, was kind of the first one to say, you know what, we're gonna do this. Then Australia, and it came down to Canada and the United States. And I thought Canada's gonna go first. We're not gonna be the last ones to sign on this Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. But we were. Obama said the U.S. would support the UN declaration, and that left Canada, and we finally signed off without condition, and it became an international instrument that we would use in Indigenous relations around the globe. And embedded in it is the free, prior, and informed consent piece, and also governance and language and culture. It does a lot of things. So, even if you don't grab a copy of the book, go check out the UN Declaration. It currently, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is the framework for reconciliation in Canada. So the two ideas are really intertwined, and provinces like British Columbia have passed what they call DRIPA legislation, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Acts, bringing it into law in certain provinces. And the national government, the federal government, has signed off on it as well and has DRIPA legislation as well. So it's definitely an interesting time. But if you're wondering sort of what they want, which is one of the harder questions I have to answer in our training programs, it'll give you a view of all of the elements that Indigenous peoples are looking for around the globe.
Yeah, no, maybe it shouldn't be terribly surprising. The four countries that were, late to sign were, all settler colony countries in terms of their modern founding. You mentioned about reconciliation. One of the things that you just have it as an aside, but this Victoria's Reconciliation Contribution Fund, this was something that I was interested to discover, and it sounds like you were, interested to discover this process as well.
Yeah. So, Victoria is really committed to reconciliation. They have a whole, the Capital Regional District has made big investments in Indigenous relations and are working with all of the communities in the Victoria region. And one of the things they did was they said, we're going to collect taxes. We're going to add a little extra box on the tax form that said, would you like to make an additional contribution to the nations on whose lands that we live on as part of our reconciliation action and commitment. And so I thought that was really, really interesting. In order to make self-government work, we're really going to swap one system for another, right? Under the Indian Act, those communities in the Victoria region are reliant on federal funding. And it does healthcare, housing, and education. They're chronically underfunded, and those are some of the challenges of the Indian Act. And to move away from the Indian Act, they've got to participate in the political and economic mainstream. Which, in the case of taxation, there are already a whole number of First Nations who are taxing for things on reserve, whether it's power lines or retail stores. There's a First Nations GST. Those kinds of taxation opportunities are how they're going to fund their self-government initiatives instead of relying on I think the current budget for Indian Affairs, which is set to be cut back set to be cut by $5 billion in this fall session, is in the $20 million range. And so that's, we're trying to get out of that dependency system into participating in the political and economic mainstream. And so taxation, real property taxation, goods and services taxation, all of those kinds of things give them an opportunity to raise revenues, to do healthcare, housing, education, to supplement those things if they want, or whatever else they deem to be important. And then if we think about major projects, there's lots of talk about partnerships, in Indigenous partnerships in major projects. That'll be another way that they can generate their own revenues to participate in the political and economic mainstream. In the book, we also talk about Manny Jules and the Indian Taxation Advisory Board. They've been trying to get a First Nations resource tax through Parliament, which would be, I think the number was 5%, and it would apply to the treaty area. So anything that happens in the treaty area in terms of resource development would see a 5% resource tax go to the communities for them to do work that they feel is important. So it's an important part of the conversation, the transition and dismantling the Indian Act.
Well, speaking of the conversation, 21 Things You Need to Know About Indigenous Self-Government is a conversation about dismantling the Indian Act. Bob, thanks very much for joining me on the program and having this conversation.
Yeah, thank you very much.